Welcome to Season 2 of Garth and Sue Talk, a series by Psych Sessions where we bring up a topic of conversation and then we just riff. These are the water cooler conversations that you have with colleagues in your department. These are the chats you might have at the bar after a good day at a teaching conference. So please, pull up a seat as we talk about teaching.
So, Sue, I had this thing happen this week, and it's happened before, and I want to talk about it because I want to give, I think, instructors permission to think through this differently. I have a feeling we'll circle back to some of the things that we've talked about before, but I have a student. I've had this student before. And she made clear to me that the reason why she took my course this time around was because I was the only one teaching it. So there's that. So that's where this story is going. It's a 200 level course that students need because they've pretty much identified at this point they want to transfer to the University of Washington, Seattle from our community college to be a psych major. And so this course is, I get really good students taking this course, and they work really hard, and they're like on my rubric where it says, below standard, meet standard, and exceed standard. Lots of my students are really working hard towards that exceed standard. This student, her work was just not great. So she started from a not great place. Now, I recognize the name, but I don't really feel like I had any bias or anything like that coming into this. In fact, it was just positive associations. That's what I had. Like, oh, you're taking my class again. Great. And so I gave, essentially, I'm on a weekly cycle where students every week are writing a kind of multi-source reflection. They're using multiple sources, but it's pretty academic, but there's also a reflective piece. Anyway, she was not from the beginning writing what I wanted. She already kind of had started behind other people. So whether she didn't read the instructions or whatever. So I'm giving feedback week 1, we actually started really in week 3, week 4, week 5, giving feedback. Don't hear anything. Eventually, the whole class is moving up, like in their skill. Many of them are moving ahead and getting better and better with this skill. And I'm sending messages out to the students that say things like, hey, this is great, the effort everybody's putting in. As you develop this skill, that bar is being raised because we're working on this together, and I'm giving you feedback, and it's expected that you take that information in. And finally, I gave her, she wasn't earning a good grade. And then finally, it came to the point where I was making videos and saying, hey, choose one of these topics to write on. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to tell you how to do it. I told them, hey, you're going to want to watch this video. She didn't do that. 90% of the class took one of my topics, did them. She didn't do that. And then gets a low grade, and then, says, what's going on here? And I said, okay, great. Come to my office hours. 20 of your peers have. Let's talk about it. You're really gonna do well. Doesn't show up. And so this goes on till this last week, which is the end of the term. And I just get blasted this email from the student about really how I've let her down. And then I gave her more very, very specific feedback about why she earned this last grade that she did. She didn't address any of those things in her response. And she just, again, big paragraph about, how she didn't get what she needed out of this course. Okay. Your response. What are you thinking? Have you had this situation happen?
Not this one specifically, but this is a fun one. And I got to say that you started this conversation with, I have a student. And I got to tell you, no good conversation starts with, I have a student.
Maybe we can change that. Maybe we can talk about, because I could tell you about students I have who are unbelievable. But
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
But those aren't the students we talk about.
No, they're the ones we quietly celebrate, I think. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So with this particular student, I think pretty much all you have to say is I've been sending these messages to you all quarter. You haven't been responding. There's nothing else that I can do. I invited you to office hours, lay it all out. And now granted, I'm senior faculty at this point, but I would also add, if you have a complaint about me regarding this course, then here is the email of my division chair, and they've been CC'd on this email to make it easy for you to contact them. Because what some students will do is they will go on the attack. And I did have a student recently who did that. This was over the summer. The student, I discovered, had been cheating. They'd been copying all their answers from Chegg, although in a conversation with the student, it really sounded like maybe a friend was writing their assignments for them, and it was the friend who was using Chegg. But in any case.
That's a good friend.
Totally a good friend. So I don't know if this friend was being paid or not, but I don't know what their relationship was. But he was in Texas, I learned. So anyway, so the student goes on the attack about how horrible and awful I am as an instructor. And under that circumstance, I just ignore all of that, because the urge to go on the defensive is so strong, but it's completely unnecessary. It's a redirect that the student is trying, and just ignore all of that and just focus on you cheated.
Yeah.
And here's the evidence. So for your particular student, it seems like, they're going to go on about how you weren't good enough to them. So you lay it all out. Here's a list of all the communications that I have tried to have with you over the course of the quarter. And I don't know if you weren't getting those messages. I don't know if you weren't checking your student email. I'm not sure what happened there, but in any case, it's an online course or a Zoom course, and you gotta check your email.
Yeah. And that's just the thing. I actually was able to do so I've been reflecting about this a lot this week, and I did a pretty good job. I think earlier in my career, I got pulled into that defensive posturing a little bit, and that just didn't go well. But I with this particular student, as I've thought through it, first of all, I'm bothered that the student is bothered. I'm bothered that her reality and her perspective doesn't line up. And I realize that, here's the primary thing I realized. I have no idea what's going on in this student's life. And so the reason why I don't go on the attack, the reason why I keep saying the same things and really just keep it to the academics, is because that's all I can speak to. At one point, the student said, I'm working a lot. I've got these classes, and you and I've talked about this before. That sometimes becomes unmanageable for students, and this becomes a lesson as a sophomore rather than maybe as a senior later on.
Agreed completely. But sometimes acknowledging that can backfire, acknowledging that the student has a lot going on in their life. Mm-hmm. And that absolutely happened to me a few years ago. A student had emailed, they were struggling with the course, and they emailed and said, I've got this going on and this going on, this other thing going on. And so I responded in what I thought was a supportive way, which was, I'm sorry to hear that you have so much going on. I truly believe that if you had more time to devote to the course, that you would have an easier time with it. And she responded not to me, but to my division chair, and was completely offended because she always has this amount of stuff going on and she does fine in other courses. So therefore, that is completely irrelevant here, despite the fact that she was the one who brought it up. So,
yeah. Well, and I mean, again, I think that's a lesson to learn, that there are certain places you want to go in these correspondences and certain places you don't. Especially in written correspondence. I feel like from a protecting yourself kind of, like putting things out there that are in print are can really come back and bite you. And I'm not saying that gives you a green light to say those things in person, but when you are in person, this is why I wanted her to come and have a 10-minute conversation with me, because I knew in week 5 we could sort it out. And a lot of that is just building rapport and making sure that there's some trust between you. And you just can't do that in email correspondence.
With email correspondence, I think what's hard is for the students who are especially overwhelmed with whatever is going on in their lives, for them to find time to meet with you. Even when you've opened up your complete schedule, they can make an appointment with you. They don't have to come during office hours. It can still be really hard for them to carve out the time. They don't have the time to do the assignments. So when are they going to have the time to meet with you? Especially when they know that they haven't carved out the time to do the assignments. So it's just a whole lot easier for them to come back at the instructor and say, you didn't do something. The reason I failed this course, or I'm getting a D in this course, is because of you. It's not my responsibility.
Right. Yeah. And, it doesn't happen with most students, but some students it happens with. And I am going to imagine that I am not the first or the last professor who this student has had this kind of an interaction with. I also found myself wondering, I don't want to discount what the student is saying about other professors. So in all of her psychology courses, she said she does very, very well. And this is the lone one. And I don't like all the things it plants in me, because then I'm thinking, well, what the heck are my colleagues doing in their psychology courses? So you can go to some pretty dark places there. And really what I've ultimately kind of realized is that I have a responsibility to my courses, to my course design, ultimately to my students. But I can't take what a student is saying to me. I can listen to it. I can gather information. I can't ever take it as truth necessarily.
That's a very good way to think about it. Especially so many years ago, my first teaching job, one of the academic counselors, who was also it was a small school, so they did all counseling. But this particular head of the counseling center, she came to a faculty meeting and she said a number of things that really stuck with me. But one of the things that she said was, I promise not to believe everything students say about you if you promise to not believe everything students say about us in the counseling center. And I thought that was completely and totally fair. So now anytime I hear a student say something about, well, this other class, blah, 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 I take it with a very large grain of salt.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Those emails can be laced with all kinds of claims. Maybe we can just have some fun real quickly about what kinds of things we do see from time to time, because one that I've seen is, a bunch of us we're talking about, a bunch of us feel this way. I've gotten that one from students, which could be true. And it may not also be true. It also might not be true.
Right. And sometimes what that means is the student complained to somebody else and the person listening just listened and decided not to engage with them. And they took that as, okay, here's somebody who agrees with me.
Right. Yeah. I guess one of the other things that kind of bothers me about this is that I have had this student for, I think, 1 or 2 other courses. And so it just shows me how much how much connection was lacking. And so we might even as faculty assume engagement. And I don't know how you define it, but I've always defined engagement as connection to the instructor, connection to peers, connection to the content. And so maybe in all 3 of those areas, we assume that we are making those connections. And yet, how do we really know?
We don't. It's like remember when we used to be in classrooms And you would be up there lecturing and you'd be watching people's faces, and some students would be nodding like, wow, I really have this student. You have no idea. I was a very good nodder when I was in college, that I can look engaged and my brain is elsewhere. So no, there's no way to tell.
Yeah.
I do know that some students get really, speaking of expectations, they get frustrated with our courses where there is a lot of writing. I had one student who actually said in class, his frustration level reached such a high level. He's like, why can't we just take a multiple choice test? So for him, he was not interested in the course content, despite my efforts to show the application to his life and his future work life, his current work life. Not interested in that at all. He had just gotten very good at taking multiple choice tests. He didn't have to put a lot of effort into studying for them, and that's all he wanted. This whole thing where he has to write out responses and he doesn't know which ones are going to be scored, that was, why do I have to do so much work in this course? Which goes back to, 2 hours out for every hour in.
Yeah. Yeah. And learning is hard, and
learning is hard,
and real learning is hard. I also didn't want to miss an opportunity with this student's email. And I guess I wouldn't have done this earlier in my career either. I didn't want to miss an opportunity to reflect on the assignment I was giving, the feedback that I was giving, and wondering, was it fair? So because ultimately I came to a point where, I kind of let the student have it in the grade because the student wasn't taking in feedback, and was just non-communicative with me. So, I guess there's so much subjectivity. We'd love to believe we're not subjective as instructors when we're grading and stuff, but there was a little bit of subjectivity, even with the rubric that I was using, where I wanted to send a message to the student that I need you to pay attention to what I'm saying to you. Do you ever sense that, like, we get to learn patterns of students over the course of the term, and you don't know it by week 3 or 4, but by week 6 or 7, you start to figure out, oh, this student isn't reading the things I am like they are making the same mistake over and over. And if so, how do you handle that with students?
For some students, they're willing to make that same mistake over and over again, because as we've talked about previously, if the student is able to get a 2.0, that's good enough, because learning is hard. So if I can get by with what I am showing, given everything that's going on in my life, this is the amount of time I have to devote to it. I see that there's feedback. I'm getting a good enough grade. So, okay, I'm not willing to change what it is that I am doing to try and get a higher grade. We see the same thing when it comes to studying for tests. A student is getting C's and D's, and they think, all right, yeah, if I change my studying, as this instructor has told me, if I do these things, it's going to be more work, but I'm going to get a higher grade, but I don't have time to do those things. So I'm going to be good enough with the C and D grade, and hopefully I end up with a 2.0 in the course. So one of the other things I learned from that counselor in that faculty meeting so many decades ago was students have a right to fail. Students have a right to get a C. Students have a right to get a D. That's perfectly fine.
Students have a right to ignore your feedback and to be
students.
Yeah.
Students have a right to ignore your feedback. And it is so frustrating as an instructor, especially young instructors, new instructors. It has nothing to do with age. It has to do with how long you've been teaching. But for new instructors, you care so much about the content. In your college years, you probably cared a lot about the content that you were learning, and you want everyone to learn it to the same extent that you did, and you want everyone to care about it to the same extent that you did, and not everybody is you. So, yeah, you've got great feedback, but the student doesn't necessarily care about that feedback. Now, I do want to. Now we're sort of focused on this group of students, which I don't think is a large group of students.
No.
I have and there's a developmental piece here too. I've got a student this quarter who, she's been doing very well on her assignments. And then there was one assignment where it was below her norm. It wasn't awful. It was like a low B, but for her, that was unusual. And she replied with, I am so glad that I missed the points on this, because now I can see where I made my mistakes and I understand this content so much better. So I reached through my computer screen and I gave her a huge hug. Yeah. And I said, this is amazing that you wrote this, and two, that you're actually thinking that. I'm like, so how did you come to this? Because this is not something that I frequently see. And she said, years ago, I was in a culinary arts program. She said, I was very young and I couldn't take in anything that anybody was telling me, that any critique of my technique, I immediately became defensive. And she said it took her some time. Years later, she was off doing other things, and she started to be able to hear critiques and began to learn from them and began to realize how much better she was becoming in whatever these various areas were as a result of that. And so for her, she has completely reframed less than ideal scores. For her, it's just an opportunity to learn now, which I think is phenomenal. But for her, 10 years between when she started that culinary arts program and the time that she ended up in my class.
Yeah, we've talked about expectations before, student expectations, instructor expectations, and in this case, her expectations, I think, changed of what learning was over time. And I think we get that, right? In the community college, we do get that with students who come back after, a decade away, and with a little more understanding about the learning process or the real world or whatever it is that happens in that 10 years. One of the other things that I was just thinking about, I checked the student's grade, and the student is going to probably get a 2.8 in the class, or something like that. So two things struck me about that. One, when a student has an unrealistic expectation of how good of a student they are, that's challenging from an instructor perspective, because I believe she sees herself as a 4.0 student. Now, I've seen students who are like, 3.5, and so they've got a lot going on, and they work really hard, and they think they're a 4.0 student, and there's more conversation usually that happens. But when a student is, at that level, which I would say is if you've earned a 2.8 in my course, like, good job. You've done a lot of the work, but I don't know what to do when there's that kind of self-deception about where they are in the pecking order of, just kind of academic success.
It all gets wrapped up in identity, right?
Yeah.
So if you see grades not as an indication of what you know, but you see grades as your identity. So students say, I'm a 4.0 student. We also hear students say, I'm a C student. I'm a 2.0 student. Yeah. And they have it in their head that they can't do any better than that. But we're not talking about those students. We're talking about I'm a 4.0 student. That's my identity. So therefore, if I'm not getting a 4.0 in your class, it can't be me.
Yeah.
Because I'm a 4.0 student. Therefore, it's got to be you.
Yeah. 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 Locus of control and all those things come into play at this point in time with those conversations. The final thing I think that I would just say about this student is I thought a lot about my course design. I thought a lot about how this student does earn a 2.8 in my course. As you and I both do, we have lower stakes, kind of scaffolded assignments through our interteaching model that build up throughout the week, and then a higher stakes, not high stakes, but higher stakes, more points earned at the culmination of learning, where we grade on what's actually been learned, and we assess it for accuracy primarily. In this case, I had to think through my course design. How does this student, who I'd actually say is, if I was just reading the final assignment of the week, I would probably say this student is probably a 2.0 student. But she has the opportunity, just by turning stuff in regularly, which I give her that. I looked back over, she's turned in everything in the entire course. So there's an amount of kind of conscientiousness there. But I had to think hard about my course, whether it's okay for that student to earn a 2.8 in my course, because there is some effort to that 2.8, and then there is some accuracy and more formal understanding. What do you think about that as a reflective kind of question?
I'm okay with that. I think that's probably true for my class too, that students maybe their grades are maybe showing just an ooch higher, but I'm also expecting much more from these students than a multiple choice test.
Yeah.
So I'm okay for them showing a little grit and resilience and persistence in continuing to turn stuff in. Now, there are some instructors I hear from students, so grains of salt, that for some instructors, you turn something in and that's good enough. So just doing the work is good enough to get the paycheck, basically. And the quality of the work doesn't matter quite so much.
Well, and then I'm sure there are, and I probably put my early career self in this other category, where it was all about the correct understanding and they really weren't rewarded for the work leading up to it, which I think you do need to find that balance for students earning grades. And it makes me think about skill development, because you just said grit. Grit is a skill, stick-to-itiveness, right? But how are students being rewarded for grit as a skill in our learning outcomes? You know what I'm saying?
I don't know that they're necessarily, that's an interesting point. Are they being rewarded for that particular skill? And for some courses, not so much. I think with a course with a multiple choice test, just showing up and taking a crack at it, you're going to get some points just by chance. So, all right. I mean, we don't think of a 25% on a 100 question multiple choice test as getting points for effort, but effectively that's what it is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, this has been helpful. Thank you. I thought actually this would be a 5-minute conversation and we'd move on to something else, but I really like where it went. Just as I think through this, it's just been a nice reflective process. So thanks for talking through it with me. Do you have any final thoughts?
I feel like we should mention at least mindset. That, because I know that some people who are listening thought mindset about 15 minutes ago. So absolutely. I mean, some students do have a fixed mindset. I'm good at psychology. I'm good at school. And it's something that I was apparently born with. And others have more of a, I'm blanking on it. What's the other one called? Fixed mindset. Growth.
Yeah.
Growth. And some students have more of a growth mindset, like my student who said, I'm glad I missed these points because now I understand these concepts so much better.
Yeah, it's really true. I had a student, I think at the beginning of this term, who sent me an email on the side, and he said, I'm so excited to be in your course. He said, my dad gave me this book on mindset by Carol Dweck. And he said his dad works for Microsoft or something like that. And he said he read it and he said it blew his mind. He said, I never understood learning in this way. And that's the ones that you want to reach through the screen and give them a hug and say, thank you.
Yes.
So maybe we'll leave on that positive note because, we get all kinds, right?
We do. And I want to take this opportunity. We haven't talked about student evaluations. I think that's coming in a future podcast.
Yeah.
But now's a good place for me to introduce the negativity bias that as people, we have a negativity bias. We grab a hold of that one student that is irking you, that one negative comment on the student evaluations. 99% are awesome, but not even 1%. It's that one student who said X that really gets under your skin. So just keep it all in perspective that most students are awesome. And that's why we do this.
Yeah. Well said. All right, Sue. Well, we'll do this again soon.
I look forward to it, Garth.